Ever get curious about like those dark parts of history? I have. Yeah. Lately, I've been looking into early 20th century serial killers, and man, their stories are intense. We're talking about way before, modern psychology and all that profiling stuff. So trying to figure these guys out, it's a real challenge.
It is. It is.
That's what we're doing today. We're going to dive deep into this guy, Earle Nelson. They could call him the Gorilla Man.
Oh, yeah.
He's considered one of America's first, like, serial sex murderers.
Wow.
Yeah, so we've got historical accounts, biographies, even some old newspaper clippings, try to piece together his story. I really want to figure out how he went from, like, a troubled past to this notorious killer, how he chose his victims, and what his case, like, reveals about criminal profiling back then.
Yeah, it's a fascinating look into the early days of trying to, understand this criminal behavior and Nelson's stories. It's a complex one. It starts with a childhood marked by loss and instability. He was born in 1897 in San Francisco. Both his parents died from syphilis before he turned 2.
Oh.
Yeah. Imagine the impact of that at such a young age.
Yeah, I mean,
I think both parents.
that's rough.
Yeah.
So he was raised by his grandmother, who was deeply religious. Seems like such a contrast to like where his life went. Did that play a role in his development, do you think?
It's certainly interesting, right? Some sources suggest that Nelson actually used his religious background to manipulate victims later on.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. He often presented himself as a devout Christian, especially when he was targeting landladies like those who advertised rooms for rent. It's possible that he saw it as a way to, gain their trust, to disarm them. But even before that, in his childhood, there were signs that something wasn't quite right. At age 10, he had a severe head injury after being hit by a streetcar while riding his bicycle.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, significant impact. He was unconscious for days.
That kind of head trauma at that age, I mean,
Yeah,
that could have some serious consequences.
absolutely. And after the accident, reports describe him suffering from headaches, memory loss, increasingly erratic behavior. Some even mention him talking to imaginary people and compulsively quoting scripture. It's like he was struggling to make sense of the world, to find some kind of, anchor in the midst of internal chaos.
And his teenage years didn't really give him any stability either. He was drawn to San Francisco's red light district, spending time in brothels. He even contracted a venereal disease. That's a stark contrast to like the strict religious environment he was raised in.
It is.
How do you think those conflicting influences might have shaped him, like psychologically?
It's hard to say for certain, but it's likely that it contributed to, inner conflict and confusion. We often see this kind of duality in individuals who struggle with impulse control and have difficulty reconciling their actions with their beliefs. And this period is when we start to see his criminal behavior emerge. Petty theft, breaking and entering. There was even an attempted assault on a young girl. Yeah, and these actions ultimately landed him in San Quentin State Prison at just 18 years old. But prison wasn't exactly a deterrent for him. He escaped multiple times from various institutions. They even called him Houdini
Really?
among the staff. Yeah, this pattern of just running away, of avoiding consequences. That would unfortunately become a recurring theme in his life.
It's interesting you mentioned the escapes. Do you think that that shows some kind of intelligence, or was it more like desperation, impulsivity? How common is that kind of cutting, with people who are also, maybe unstable?
It's a good question. It's possible that his escapes were a combination of both. He may have had some degree of cunning, planning ability, but it's also likely that his actions were fueled by a need to avoid confinement, control. A lot of individuals with psychological instability, they exhibit impulsive behavior, and their actions may seem calculated, even if they're not really thought out. It's often driven by a need to, just escape uncomfortable situations or to satisfy some immediate desire. And in Nelson's case, this pattern of impulsivity and disregard for rules, it seems to have, extended to other areas of his life, especially his brief marriage to Mary Martin.
Yeah, their marriage was very short and very tumultuous. She described him as having, quote, jealous rages, bizarre sexual demands, and increasingly violent behavior.
Wow.
What can we learn from her account? Like, what was he like during that time?
Yeah, Mary Martin's testimony, it gives us a crucial glimpse into, his personal relationships. Her descriptions paint a picture of someone struggling with emotional regulation, possibly exhibiting signs of paranoia and possessiveness, his jealous rages and violent outbursts. That suggests like a deep-seated insecurity and a difficulty coping with interpersonal conflict. And her accounts of, bizarre sexual demands, they could potentially point to early manifestations of sadistic tendencies, although it's difficult to confirm without, more detail.
So we're seeing some patterns. Impulsivity, disregard for rules, a troubled personal life, and these potential signs of a darker side.
Right.
His early life, I mean, it almost seems like a breeding ground for, instability, the law of his parents, the head injury, the conflicting influences of his upbringing and his experiences in the red light district.
Absolutely.
It's almost like a recipe for disaster.
And sadly, that's exactly what it became. Because in 1926, Earle Nelson's true reign of terror began.
This is where the Gorilla Man really comes in, right? I'm ready to dive into the details of his crimes, but maybe we should pause here for a minute.
That's a good idea. Take a moment and consider what stands out to you so far about Nelson's early life. What clues, if any, do you see that might have foreshadowed the darkness to come? We'll be back in a moment to delve into the horrifying details of his killing spree.
Okay, so we've laid some groundwork here, tried to understand, the complexities of Earle Nelson's early life and the factors that might have, contributed to his descent into darkness. Now let's shift our focus to 1926, the West Coast,
Yeah,
and the beginning of his murderous rampage.
yeah.
His first known victim was Clara Newman, a 60-year-old landlady in San Francisco.
Right, and this is where we see his modus operandi. It starts to take shape. Nelson often posed as a potential tenant. He used this, seemingly charming personality and this religious facade to gain the trust of landladies
Yeah.
who advertised rooms for rent. It was a calculated tactic, preying on their kindness and willingness to help.
It's chilling how he used that perception of trustworthiness, especially emphasizing his Christian background. Was that common back then? Did other serial killers do that kind of thing?
Well, we don't have extensive data from that era, but there are cases, documented cases of serial killers using similar tactics, often exploiting societal expectations and vulnerabilities to, gain access to their victims. Think about H.H. Holmes, who operated a murder castle. It was disguised as a hotel
Really?
during the 1893 Chicago World's Fair. Yeah. He used deception and a charming persona to lure victims to their deaths. It speaks to, a disturbing level of cunning and premeditation.
So even back then, investigators, they were starting to realize this wasn't just random, this was planned out. There was a motive.
Yeah, and unfortunately, Clara Newman would be just the first of many victims. Nelson's killings, they escalated. They spread across California, Oregon, and Washington. Newspapers at the time, they dubbed him the Dark Strangler. Really fueled this public fear as the body count rose. Imagine the terror
Oh, yeah.
of that time. No internet, no widespread communication, just this chilling realization that a serial killer was out there.
Yeah, it's a stark contrast to how we get information today.
It is.
Back then, I mean, people relied on newspapers and, word of mouth, which could easily amplify fear and speculation.
Right.
And the details of Nelson's crimes, brutal. They often involved, strangulation and sexual assault, even after death. This wasn't just about taking a life. This is about power and control, indulging in a truly dark side of his psyche. One case that really stuck out to me was that of Lola Cowan, a 14-year-old girl from Winnipeg, Canada.
Right, right. Lola's case is particularly disturbing because she was one of the few victims who was, significantly mutilated after death. It adds another layer of depravity to his crimes, and it suggests an escalation of these sadistic tendencies.
Yeah.
And it raises a key question. How does Nelson's, geographic pattern and victim selection fit into what we know now about, serial killer profiling?
Yeah, that's what I'm curious about. Back then, they didn't have all the fancy profiling techniques, like we have today. It was more about piecing clues together, relying on eyewitnesses, which, come on,
Right.
not always reliable. So how did they even begin to understand a guy like Nelson?
Well, while modern profiling, wasn't established during Nelson's time, we can still see some early parallels. His focus on landladies as victims, that's a clear sign of what we call signature behavior. It's a unique element of the crime that goes beyond the act of killing itself. It reflects a specific fantasy or a psychological need that drives the offender.
So even back then, they were starting to realize that these actions, I mean, there was something else behind them. There was a reason.
Exactly. And the geographic spread of his crimes tells us something, too. He wasn't just in one city or one region. He He moved constantly, likely hitchhiking, stowing away on trains, suggests a transient lifestyle, possibly an attempt to, stay ahead of law enforcement. This mobility, it was a hallmark of many early serial killers, as transportation limitations, that often define their reach. It makes you wonder how Nelson's patterns might have differed if he had access to cars or, even planes.
Yeah, right. I mean, it's a chilling thought, imagining how much wider his reach could have been with, all the modern transportation we have today. But thankfully, his reign of terror, it didn't last forever. His downfall began, ironically, in the very city where he committed one of his most heinous acts, Winnipeg, Canada.
Right, right. The murder of Emily Patterson. Her body was discovered under her son's bed. A truly horrifying detail. It speaks to the lasting trauma, inflicted on the families of his victims. And this case was a turning point. Police found evidence linking Nelson to the crime, including a knife. It had burn marks on it, and a stolen wedding ring. And then there was the botched escape attempt.
He tried to board the same train as the officers that were transporting him.
He did.
I mean, come on.
That's audacious.
What was he thinking?
It's possible he was experiencing a heightened sense of grandiosity, believing he could outsmart the authorities. Or maybe it was just a desperate act of a man who knew he was cornered. Either way, it failed, and he was apprehended, taken to the Rupert Street police station. And the public, they were fascinated. Thousands gathered outside, hoping to catch a glimpse of this notorious killer. Nelson was a media sensation. His every move was, all over the headlines.
It's fascinating to think about how his capture and trial played out in the context of, the 1920s media. It was the golden age of newspapers.
Right.
And Nelson, he became this symbol of fear and, morbid curiosity. So they finally got their man. What happened next? Did he confess?
Well, this is where things get even more complex. Initially, Nelson did confess. He even made chilling statements to reporters. Yeah, but then he recanted, claimed he was innocent. His trial became a whirlwind of legal maneuvering, witness testimonies, and attempts to just understand this mind of a killer.
Right.
Remember, this was before forensic psychology was truly established. They were working with limited tools and knowledge, relying heavily on eyewitness accounts and physical evidence. But Nelson's ex-wife, Mary Martin, she provided a crucial piece of the puzzle. She testified that he was, quote, absolutely insane.
It's a tragic situation, all around. Was he a product of his circumstances? Was he truly evil? I mean, or was it both? It's a question that still, haunts us today.
It does, and it's one we'll continue to explore as we, delve into the trial, the verdict, and the lasting legacy of Earle Nelson, the Gorilla Man. Stay tuned.
We left off with Earle Nelson's trial and trying to figure out, the man behind the monster.
And don't forget, this is 1927, the golden age of newspapers. The public, they were captivated by this case. Every move that Nelson made, every word was like blaster all over the headlines. This whole media frenzy just cemented his place in, the history of serial killers.
Yeah. So the trial was, a huge public spectacle. What about the legal proceedings? What was the prosecution's strategy?
Well, given the brutality of the crimes and all the evidence piling up, the prosecution focused on portraying Nelson as this cold and calculated killer, emphasizing the premeditation and the horrific nature of what he did. They argued that his use of religion to gain trust, that was a sign of his manipulative nature, and that his repeated escapes showed a clear pattern of criminal intent.
And what about Nelson's defense? Did they try to counter that?
His attorney argued for insanity. He presented evidence from, being who knew Nelson, claiming that he had shown signs of mental instability for a long time. They pointed to his, troubled childhood, the head injury, his erratic behavior, and of course the testimony of his ex-wife, Mary Martin, who described him as absolutely insane. It was a complex legal strategy because the understanding of mental illness back then and its role in criminal behavior, it was far less developed in the 1920s.
So they were basically saying he wasn't really responsible for his actions because of his mental state.
Exactly. They were trying to raise doubts about his ability to tell right from wrong and to control his impulses. And it's important to remember that the legal definition of insanity, it's changed a lot over time. What they might have considered a strong insanity defense back then might not hold up in court today.
That's interesting. So how'd they interpret all this?
Well, the jury, they deliberated for just 40 minutes.
40 minutes?
Before finding Earle Nelson guilty of murder, he was sentenced to death.
Wow, 40 minutes. That seems really fast, especially for a case like this.
It does, and it really highlights the, the societal and legal context of that time. Public sentiment was very much against Nelson, and the idea of mental illness as a mitigating factor, it just wasn't as widely accepted as it is today.
Even facing, his own death, Nelson maintained his innocence. He claimed he was wrongly accused. It's almost as if he couldn't or wouldn't, I don't know, understand the seriousness of what he did.
It does point to a lack of remorse, a chilling detachment from the reality of his crimes. This, absence of remorse is often seen as a hallmark of psychopathy, although it's impossible to definitively diagnose a historical figure like Nelson, using today's psychological standards.
So on January 13th, 1928, at the Vaughan Street Jail in Winnipeg, Earle Nelson was hanged. His final words were, "I forgive those who have wronged me." It's a chilling statement, almost as if he was the victim.
Right. It's a disturbing reminder of the distorted reality that some serial killers they live in. Their perception of themselves and the world around them, it could be just fundamentally different from our own.
Okay, so what does this all mean? What's Earle Nelson's legacy?
Well, his confirmed kill count, likely over 20, it remained a record for decades. But beyond just the sheer number of victims, his case is a stark reminder of the early days of trying to understand serial killers. They were working with very limited tools, limited knowledge, grappling with the dark side of human behavior without the benefit of modern psychology and criminal profiling.
It makes you wonder how his case would be viewed, today. Would he be considered legally insane? Would he be diagnosed with a specific personality disorder?
Right, right. Those are questions we can only speculate about. But what we can say for sure is that Earle Nelson's case, it was a turning point. It brought the horrors of serial murder into the public consciousness. It sparked a fascination that continues to this day.
Well, there you have it, our deep dive into the life and crimes of Earle Nelson, the Gorilla Man. From a troubled youth to a notorious killer, his story it's a haunting reminder of the dark side of humanity.
Absolutely. And it leaves us with a lot to think about. How much progress have we really made in understanding, the minds of serial killers? Are we just scratching the surface? And what can we learn from these historical cases to better protect ourselves and society from future acts of violence? These are important questions to consider as we continue to try and understand the complexities of human behavior.